1938. Old men and their families gather at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. These are some of the last surviving veterans of the American Civil War. This is never-before-seen footage of the last reunion of the blue and the gray. 75 years earlier, these men had inflicted unimaginable suffering on one another. But it was the suffering also that brought them together. 75 years earlier, none of them could have foreseen this. Old bitterness became myth. Deeds became legend. Through smoke, fire, and blood, these men had forged a new nation, a new world, a new birth of freedom. Above all, they were fervently united in the belief that their achievements should be remembered, their battlegrounds preserved, and their stories told. In the middle of the 19th century, Americans North and South look at each other and don't like what they see. Perceptions form. Northerners are greedy and arrogant. Southerners are cruel and lazy. Long-standing arguments about slavery's expansion or abolition flare throughout the 1830s and 40s. Only grudging compromise holds the Union together. By the 1850s, compromise is failing. The fugitive slave crisis brings Southern slaveholders into Northern neighborhoods, while Uncle Tom's Cabin galvanizes many with its portrayal of slavery's cruelties. Legislation intended to make slavery a state-by-state issue leads only to sectarian bloodshed. John Brown's attempt to lead a slave uprising convinces Southerners that their very lives are in danger. Slave states begin to militarize. Two men born in the same state, scarcely 120 miles apart, see it all unfold. Abraham Lincoln is a prairie lawyer turned politician, self-taught but of towering intellect, a wrestler, a storyteller. He is deeply opposed to slavery, but recognizes that the nation's feelings are not yet in line with his own. Jefferson Davis is a reclusive plantation millionaire living in Mississippi, a Mexican war hero, former Secretary of War, now an influential U.S. Senator. When Lincoln wins the 1860 presidential election, Southerners rightly suspect that he plans to abolish or limit slavery. One by one, slave states secede from the Union. Together, they form the Confederate States of America and appoint Jefferson Davis as president. The growing divisions have become very real. By March 1861, the seceded states are seizing federal property and armories within their borders. But the Union soldiers in Fort Sumter refuse to leave. In April, South Carolinians bombard the fort. Federal forces return fire. 34 hours later, the Federals surrender. The first battle of the Civil War is a Confederate victory, with no casualties on either side. President Lincoln refuses to recognize the Confederacy and deems secession unconstitutional. He calls for 75,000 volunteers to quell the rebellion. In response, more states secede, with border states likely to follow. But Lincoln manages to maintain their loyalty with a mixture of political cunning and military coercion. America's roads and byways bustle with enthusiastic citizen soldiers. Both sides believe the other is weak and that victory will be easy. The opposing forces come to blows in July, 30 miles outside the U.S. Capitol, near a stream called Bull Run. The Yankees pierce the Confederate line, but are forced to retreat after a steady rebel named Thomas Jackson reorganizes the defenders and stands like a stone wall in the face of repeated assaults. With 4,500 casualties, the Battle of Bull Run is the bloodiest battle in American history up to that time. Confederate success continues with victories at Wilson's Creek, Missouri, and at Ball's Bluff, Virginia. Battles flare along the coast as the North begins to blockade southern ports in hopes of strangling the South into submission. Both sides prepare for a long and bloody conflict. The North must conquer the South. Southerners come to see the fight as a second war of independence. And like the first, they need only to hold on until the North tires of conflict or until they gain foreign recognition. 1862 opens with Union victories in the West. Mill Springs, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Pea Ridge, the fall of Nashville. Up-and-coming General Ulysses S. Grant tells the Confederates at Fort Donelson that no terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. U.S. Grant will be known as Unconditional Surrender Grant for the rest of his life. Grant moves further south, but is attacked by General Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh. The Confederates win the first day, but Johnston is mortally wounded, and the advance stalls as the Federals reorganize along the banks of the Tennessee River. Grant launches an assault of equal ferocity the next day and drives the Confederates from the field. 23,700 men fall in 2 days of action. Union success continues in the Western Territories as Confederate dreams of capturing Southern California are dashed. Union General George McClellan is very slow to move his giant army into Virginia. While McClellan lingers, Stonewall Jackson begins a masterful campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, stirring panic in the North. The world's first battle between ironclad warships, the USS Monitor and CSS Virginia, is fought to a stalemate in Hampton Roads. McClellan at last moves to the Virginia Peninsula by sea. He is slowed by a siege at Yorktown and in battle at Williamsburg and Seven Pines. Although he gets within sight of the Confederate capital at Richmond, he will go no further. With McClellan at the gates, General Robert E. Lee takes command of the defenders around Richmond. Lee is a daring leader and seizes the initiative. Joined by Stonewall Jackson, he attacks McClellan for 7 days, each time driving his opponent further from Richmond. Lee moves northward, hoping to defeat Union forces near Washington before McClellan can help. Jackson wins a battle at Cedar Mountain before rejoining his army for a second victory at Bull Run. Lee is supremely confident. To further demoralize the North, Lee invades Northern Territory, but a copy of his marching orders is found by Union soldiers. McClellan's army moves to destroy Lee's divided forces. The Confederates put up a desperate fight at South Mountain, buying just enough time to reunite near Sharpsburg. McClellan attacks before dawn on September 17th. The fight rages all day and leaves no clear victor. Lee suffers heavy losses, but escapes with his army intact. McClellan will be replaced by General Ambrose Burnside. 23,000 American casualties, more than D-Day, Pearl Harbor, or 9/11. Antietam remains America's bloodiest day. The North declares a victory, and President Lincoln forecasts the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, all slaves in areas under rebellion will be free. France and England had contemplated recognizing the Confederacy, even supplying aid. But both nations have long abolished slavery, and with this proclamation, their support for the South evaporates. Meanwhile, Confederate efforts to regain lost ground in the West are repulsed at Perryville and Corinth. Seeking to overwhelm the Confederacy, Lincoln orders a coordinated offensive, striking targets across the South. But the Union meets with defeat at Chickasaw Bayou and disaster at Fredericksburg. Only a narrow victory by General William Rosecrans at Stones River preserves Northern morale. Lincoln breathes a momentary sigh of relief, but the worst was yet to come. January 1st, 1863, the day of Jubilee. The Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Black men are now allowed to enlist in the Union Army. Black recruits fill the ranks, knowing that military victories will be the only assurance of freedom. Lincoln turns his sights to Vicksburg, the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Vicksburg is the key, declares Lincoln. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. By river, land, and canal, General Grant works from January to April with little progress. Union forces in the East are in disarray. After the bloodbath at Fredericksburg, Lincoln dismisses General Burnside and promotes General Joe Hooker, a hard fighter who pledges no mercy for Robert E. Lee. Hooker crosses the Rappahannock River to outflank Lee near Chancellorsville. Lee strikes back with great fury. Stunned by Lee's aggression, Hooker retreats back across the river after 5 days of savage fighting. In the heat of battle, Stonewall Jackson is mortally wounded by his own men. It is Lee's greatest victory, but he is left in mourning by the death of his most trusted lieutenant. With 30,000 casualties, Chancellorsville is the bloodiest of all American battles up to that time. At the same time, Grant strikes towards Vicksburg. Over the course of 17 days, he wins 5 battles across Mississippi and forces the Confederates to retreat into the river fortress. After failed attacks, Grant lays siege, cutting off their supplies. In June, General Lee invades Pennsylvania. President Lincoln unceremoniously dismisses Hooker and places General George Gordon Meade in command of the Army of the Potomac. On July 1st, 1863, a battle begins between Lee and Meade at Gettysburg. Soldiers pour in for the next 2 days as fighting intensifies. Confederates win on the first day, but Meade's men hold their ground on the second. On the third, Lee launches a grand attack known as Pickett's Charge. That attack fails. Gettysburg is the bloodiest of all American battles. The Union victory sends Lee and his army back to Virginia, weakened but intact. Just as Lee retreats, the Confederates at Vicksburg succumb to 47 days of siege. With the loss of Port Hudson, the Union now controls the entire Mississippi River. The Confederacy is cut in two. Near Charleston, U.S. colored troops prove their valor at the Battle of Fort Wagner. Union spirits remain high as General Rosecrans captures Chattanooga and moves into North Georgia. General Braxton Bragg lashes back at the Battle of Chickamauga. After 3 days of combat, the Union Army is defeated and forced to retreat back to Chattanooga. General George Thomas, a native Virginian, conducts a heroic rear guard action that saves the Union Army from destruction. 34,000 fall, the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Bragg holds Rosecrans at Chattanooga and awaits his surrender, while President Lincoln visits Gettysburg and delivers the Gettysburg Address, telling the gathered mourners to hear highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain. that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Lincoln also sends Grant to the beleaguered city of Chattanooga. Grant quickly opens up a cracker line to feed his men. Then, in 3 consecutive days in late November, launches attacks that send Bragg's men streaming from Chattanooga. Stalemate still reigns in the east. Lee and Meade each launch failed attacks at Bristow Station and Mine Run. The armies go into winter quarters. Despite several huge battles, the Virginia lines are virtually unchanged since last year. By the end of 1863, the Confederacy has suffered severe losses in men and territory, but Northerners are tiring of war and bloodshed. Lincoln will be up for re-election in 1864. If the Confederates can hold out and continue to sap Northern morale, there is a chance that Lincoln will lose to a candidate who will seek a negotiated peace. The grim war continues. Abraham Lincoln promotes Grant to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. With more than 1 million soldiers under his command, Grant plans a massive offensive to bring the Confederacy to its knees. Grant's armies move simultaneously on 5 fronts, hoping that the South cannot parry all his thrusts. Attacks on the Red River, in the Shenandoah Valley, and south of Richmond are all blunted by smaller Southern forces. In early May, Grant's largest armies launch colossal campaigns aimed at Richmond and Atlanta. Grant stays east and finds Lee's army the toughest opponent he has faced. Lee draws Grant into battle in the wilderness, where Grant's greater firepower is rendered meaningless in the tangled thickets. Lee's veterans attack and defend with ferocity, as 2 days of fighting produce some 30,000 casualties, with no real result. On the first day of fighting, Grant smokes 20 cigars, whittles a pair of gloves to shreds, and weeps in the evening. The battle is a stalemate, but Grant doggedly continues on towards Richmond. Union soldiers cheer and gain great confidence in their general. But General Lee moves faster and beats Union forces to the crossroads at Spotsylvania, where the armies engage for 2 full weeks. The battle climaxes at the Mule Shoe, where Yankees and rebels fight on either side of the same earthwork for 18 hours. The Union men fall back. Another 30,000 men are killed, wounded, or captured. Grant keeps moving south, crashing across the North Anna River and swinging down to Cold Harbor. Eager to smash Lee's army, he launches a huge frontal assault that is decimated by Lee's fortified veterans. A bloodbath even more lopsided than the Battle of Fredericksburg 18 months earlier. The Northern public is stunned. In the West, Sherman moves upon Johnston's army, and in ferocious fighting at Rocky Face Ridge and Resaca, continues toward Atlanta. Johnston blunts Sherman's attacks at New Hope Church and at Kennesaw Mountain, but the larger Union armies continue to outflank the Confederates. Meanwhile, Grant crosses the James River and moves on Petersburg, through which the railroad lines into Richmond and all of the capital's supplies pass. Without Petersburg, Richmond must fall. Union soldiers reach Petersburg and heavily outnumber Confederate defenders under General Beauregard. But Southern tenacity and Union timidity allow time for Lee to reach Petersburg with his army. Grant begins to cut off Petersburg's rail lines and besieges the city. Jefferson Davis places John Bell Hood in command at Atlanta. Hood launches a counteroffensive in July, but in desperate fighting at Peachtree Creek and east of Atlanta, fails to drive Sherman away from the city. Lee detaches General Jubal Early to invade the North and regain the strategic initiative. Early reaches the Union capital's doorstep, not long before Grant suffers a bloody setback at the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg. With Richmond and Atlanta still standing, and Confederate raids raising alarms across the North, Lincoln expects to be voted out of office. At this pivotal time, the North scores military victories that ensure Lincoln's re-election. Union soldiers and sailors capture Mobile Bay, followed by Sherman's capture of Atlanta. Confederates also lose key positions south of Richmond, while Early's rebels are pushed away from Washington and dealt crushing defeats at 3rd Winchester and Cedar Creek. Although Petersburg and Richmond remain defiant, the Northern public expresses their confidence in the war effort and re-elects Lincoln in a landslide. With Atlanta secure, Sherman begins his march to the sea, burning and pillaging his way across Georgia. General Hood strikes off for Nashville, hoping to draw Sherman into a pursuit. Sherman continues his march, trusting General Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, to deal with Hood. Thomas comes through and all but destroys the ragged Confederate army at the battles of Franklin and Nashville in November and December. Sherman captures the seaport of Savannah, Georgia in late December, bringing his march to a close. At year's end, the Confederacy has little hope of a negotiated peace. Union soldiers are able to march at will through the Deep South. The blockade is almost complete. Although Virginia still stands, the end is in sight.
Keep your heads down, keep your heads down. The front, reload!
1865. With endless skirmishing at Petersburg, Sherman marches through the Carolinas, meeting minimal resistance. Confederates lash out at Bentonville, but gain nothing. His strength waning, General Joe Johnston writes Lee saying, "I can do no more than annoy Sherman." With Sherman closing on Petersburg, Lee launches half his army upon Grant at Fort Stedman. But the Confederates cannot break out. Grant counterattacks all along the line, making key gains. The Confederate Congress desperately authorizes the enlistment of black soldiers, but no such unit sees combat. Union victories at White Oak Road and Five Forks set the stage for the breakthrough of Confederate lines. Petersburg and Richmond are evacuated as Lee moves westward. Savage combat at Sailor's Creek further degrades Lee's forces. Some of Lee's subordinates urge him to disperse the army and continue the war with guerrilla tactics. Lee firmly declines. Finally, on April 9th, Grant catches Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. Out of food, surrounded, and appallingly outnumbered, Lee surrenders. Johnston is brought to the same conclusion later that month, surrendering to Sherman at Bennett's place. As the news spreads, Confederate units across the country lay down their arms. Amidst these surrenders, tragedy strikes. President Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Southern sympathizer. North and South are both deprived of Lincoln's leadership in the painful Reconstruction to come. Jefferson Davis flees southward but is captured in Georgia. "4 years, 10,000 engagements. At last, the carnage is over. 620,000 dead, 2% of the American population at that time. Today, 2% would equal more than 6.5 million Americans gone. In the wake of victory, 200,000 Union soldiers marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in the Grand Review. Grant and Lee both urge a peaceful return to civilian life. As Confederate states re-enter the Union, the nation ratifies the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery and granting citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. But it will take much longer for these new rights to be enforced by law. During and after the turbulent Reconstruction period, Civil War veterans form groups, write books, and found newspapers. Cemeteries are established for soldiers on both sides. Battlefield land is preserved, and veterans erect monuments on these battlefields to memorialize their deeds.